5 title options. 1. She said yes to a dying stranger to save his little girl. Then he opened his eyes and changed everything she believed about love. 2. A dying cowboy begged her to marry him. His daughter wouldn't be taken. She said yes. He survived, and nothing was ever the same again. 3. She married him while the doctor stood outside counting his final hours. Then the man they said wouldn't last the week rose up and fought for her. 4. They told her he'd be dead before the ink dried on the marriage certificate. She stayed anyway. What he did next broke every woman in town to tears. 5. He had no future left to offer, only frightened little girl and a last desperate plea. She said yes to save the child and lost her heart to the father. Adeline Mercer signed her name to a marriage certificate while the man lying in the next room was still bleeding through his bandages, and she did it knowing she would most likely be a widow before the first snow fell on Willow Creek. She pressed the pen hard enough to tear the paper. Her hand didn't shake. That was the part nobody who knew her story could ever quite explain. If this story already has your heart, do us a favor right now, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you never miss a single story we bring you. And when you leave a comment down below, tell us what city and state you're watching from. We read every single one, and it means the world to us to see how far these stories travel. Now stay with us, because what happens next is going to change everything you thought you knew about love, survival, and the kind of courage that doesn't make any noise at all. Part 1. The morning Samuel Whitaker knocked on Adeline Mercer's door. She was already awake. She was always already awake. Sleep had become something of a stranger to her in the 2 years, since she'd buried both her parents in the same winter, 6 weeks apart, one after the other, like the cold itself had decided it wanted them both. She'd inherited the small tailor shop on the eastern edge of Willow Creek's Main Street, and she'd inherited the silence that came with it. And she'd learned to fill both the shop and the silence with work, because work was the one thing that never asked anything from her she couldn't give. She was at the table with a shirt half pinned across her knee when the knock came. 3 knocks, deliberate and spaced apart the way a man knocks when he's rehearsed what he's going to say and isn't entirely sure it's going to land well. She opened the door and found Dr. Samuel Whitaker standing on her front step with his hat in both hands, turning the brim around and around in a slow circle the way men do when they're carrying something uncomfortable. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Dr. Whitaker." She looked past him at the pale gray morning. "It's early." "Yes, ma'am. I know it is. I apologize for the hour." He cleared his throat. "May I come in?" She stepped aside. He came in and stood in the center of the small front room and looked at the piles of fabric and the half-finished work spread across every surface, and he had the good grace not to comment on any of it. She didn't offer him anything to drink. She didn't sit down either. She just stood with her arms crossed and waited, because whatever this was, she already understood it wasn't a social call. "I'm going to speak plainly," he said. "I'd appreciate that." "You know Caleb Dawson." She did know the name. Everyone in Willow Creek knew Caleb Dawson. He ran the Dawson Ranch about 4 miles out past the creek bed, roughly 300 acres of grazing land that he'd worked himself from the time his father left it to him. He wasn't a loud man. He didn't come in town looking for attention or trouble. He paid his debts on time. He nodded to people when he passed them on the street. He had a daughter, a quiet little girl named Lillian, who came into town sometimes sitting up on the wagon seat beside him, always with her hair braided, always watching everything around her with those large, serious eyes. Adeline had repaired 2 shirts for him, maybe 3 years back. He'd been polite. He'd paid without argument. She hadn't spoken to him since. "I know of him," she said. Dr. Whitaker nodded. "He had an accident 2 weeks ago. Cattle push went wrong. He took a horn to the side, deep laceration, lower rib cage. At first it looked manageable." He paused. "It isn't." She waited. "The wound's infected, badly. I've done everything I know to do, Miss Mercer. I've had a colleague ride up from Denver. He agrees with my assessment." He looked at her steadily. "We don't believe Caleb will survive the week." The room was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry to hear that," Adeline said, and she meant it because she was not a hard woman. "But I don't understand what it has to do with me." Dr. Whitaker turned his hat one more time around. Caleb has a request. A specific one. And before you tell me it's impossible, I'm asking you to hear the whole of it before you answer. She didn't say anything. She let that stand as permission. His daughter Whitaker said, "Lillian, you know Caleb's wife passed Eleanor Dawson 4 years ago now." Fever. The girl's been with Caleb since, just the two of them out on that ranch. He looked down at the hat in his hands. Eleanor's family, the Hartwell family, out of Denver, they've been making noise ever since Eleanor died about taking the girl. They've got money and lawyers, and they've always believed the ranch was no kind of place to raise a girl of quality, as they say. While Caleb was healthy, they couldn't do much. He's her father. He has standing. But he stopped. Now they've already sent a letter. They know he's dying. And when he goes, there's nothing standing between Lillian and them. There's no one else? No family? His brother passed 5 years ago. His parents are gone. There's a cousin in Kansas, but they haven't spoken in a decade. Whitaker shook his head. There's no one. She looked at him. Dr. Whitaker. I still don't understand what this has to do with me. He looked her straight in the eye. Caleb wants to marry before he dies. A legal marriage would give his wife standing in the custody question. It wouldn't be ironclad, but it would complicate things considerably for the Hartwells. A woman with a legal claim to the ranch and an established relationship with the child would be far harder to push aside than an empty chair. He paused. He asked me to come to you. The silence that followed was long enough that Adeline could hear the wind against the front window. He asked for me specifically, she said at last. He did. Why? Whitaker seemed to consider how to say the next part. He said you were a woman who understood what it was to be alone. He said he'd watched you carry your losses without falling apart. He said he stopped again. He said he needed someone strong. Not someone looking for rescue. Someone who would do it for the right reason. Adeline stood very still. She thought about Lillian Dawson's serious eyes watching the world from the wagon seat. She thought about what it meant for a man who knew he was dying to spend his last good hours worrying about his daughter instead of himself. She thought about what it meant for him to choose her, not the prettiest woman in town, not the youngest, not the most well-connected, but her. A seamstress living alone above a tailor shop, patching other people's lives together because she'd never quite figured out how to patch her own. If I do this, she said carefully, and he dies, what happens to me? You'd have legal standing to remain on the ranch. The property would pass to you as his wife unless the will specifies otherwise, and Caleb has indicated he intends to update the will before. Whitaker stopped. You would not be left with nothing. And Lillian? If the judge agrees. If, yes. If he didn't pretend otherwise, I won't tell you it's a certainty. The Hartwells have money, and they'll spend it. But a wife on record, with the doctor and the preacher as witnesses, and time lived in the home, that's a fight worth having. Without it, there's no fight at all. Adeline set down the shirt she'd forgotten she was still holding. She walked to the window and looked out at Willow Creek waking up in the gray morning light. A man across the street was sweeping his porch. A horse stood tied to the post in front of the general store. Somewhere down the block, someone was frying something that smelled like bacon and wood smoke and an ordinary life. She thought about how long it had been since she'd had something that felt like a life, instead of just a series of days she was getting through. When, she said. Today, Dr. Whitaker said, this morning, if possible. He hesitated, he's holding on, but every day matters. She turned back around. Give me 20 minutes. She didn't know what she was agreeing to. Not fully. She told herself that later, on nights when she tried to make sense of the decision. She told herself she hadn't understood what she was walking into. But that wasn't entirely true, and she knew it even then. She understood exactly enough. She changed into her better dress, the dark blue one she kept for Sundays and funerals, and she braided her brown hair and pinned it back, and she did not look in the small mirror above the wash basin for more than a second. Because she didn't want to talk herself out of it. She locked the tailor shop behind her and walked out into the morning. Willow Creek was a town of maybe 400 people, and the kind of familiarity that could be either comforting or suffocating, depending on the day. People nodded to her as she walked with Dr. Whitaker toward the church. A woman named Bertha Gaines, who ran the boarding house and had an opinion about everything, stopped sweeping her step long enough to watch them pass with narrowed eyes. Adeline didn't look at her. The church was small and plain, the way most things in Willow Creek were small and plain. And Reverend Thomas Ellis was already there, waiting, a thin man in his 60s with a kind face and the careful stillness of someone who had sat with the dying before and understood what was being asked of him today. "Miss Mercer," he said, and shook her hand with both of his. "I want you to know I believe what you're doing today is an act of great generosity." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. They did not go into the main sanctuary. There was a small side room, a sitting room of sorts, used for private conversations and occasional quiet prayers, and that was where they brought her. Caleb Dawson was sitting in a straight-back chair near the window. That was the first surprise. She'd expected him to be lying down. She'd expected someone who looked like he was already half gone. She'd expected to feel, walking through that door, the particular heaviness that settles over a room when death is very close. Instead, he was sitting upright, both hands flat on his knees, wearing what was clearly his best shirt, despite the fact that it hung slightly wrong on him, too loose across the shoulders. She noticed, in the way of a man who had lost weight rapidly. He was younger than she'd remembered, or maybe she'd just never looked at him long enough before. Maybe 35, lean in the way ranchmen were lean, with dark hair gone gray at the temples, and a jaw that needed shaving but hadn't been, and eyes brown, steady. And carrying more pain than he was letting onto his face, that watched her walk in the room and didn't look away. There was a fine line of sweat along his hairline. His color was wrong. She could see that even from across the room. But he had gotten himself into that chair, and he had straightened that collar, and he was sitting up when he could have been lying down, and something about that precision, that refusal to be diminished, caught in her chest in a way she hadn't expected. He said, "Miss Mercer." His voice was rougher than she remembered, lower, like something had stripped away the outer layer of it. "Mr. Dawson," she said. They looked at each other. He said, "I owe you an apology before anything else. Sending Sam to your door this morning with a request like that, it wasn't fair. I want you to know I understand that. You didn't have much time for fair," she said. "No," he looked at his hands for a moment. "No, I didn't." He looked back up. "I also want to be clear about something. What I'm asking of you isn't small. I know that. If you say no, I will not think less of you. If you walk out of this room right now, I will understand it completely." "I'm not walking out," she said. He was quiet for a second. "All right, but I want to ask you something first." "Ask. Why me?" She looked at him directly. "Willow Creek has women who've known you longer. Women who might have more reason to say yes than I do. Why did you ask Dr. Whitaker to come to my door?" Caleb Dawson was quiet for long enough that she thought maybe he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Because you lost people, and you didn't let it make you cruel. I've watched you, not in any particular way. I don't mean that, just the way you pay attention to people in a town this size. When the Carlisle boy broke his arm last spring, and his mother was losing her mind in the street, you were the one who stopped and talked her down. When old Mrs. Pruitt got behind on her winter coat and everyone knew it, you finished it anyway and told her it was already paid for." He paused. "You didn't do any of that to be seen. That's what I mean." Adeline didn't say anything. "My daughter needs someone who does things because they're right," he said. "Not because they're watching themselves do them. That's the only calculation I was making." Somewhere outside the window, a bird was making a sound in the cold morning air. "How is she?" Adeline asked. Something moved across his face. Something that cost him something. "She's scared," he said. "She's trying very hard not to show me, because she thinks if she shows me it'll make my dying harder." He stopped. "She's 8 years old, and she's trying to protect me." Adeline felt something in her chest go tight and stay there. I can't. He stopped again, steadied himself. I can't fix that. I can't fix being the person who's leaving her. But I can try to make sure the people who stay, the person who stays, is someone worth staying. You think that's me, Adeline said. I'm hoping, he said. That's all I've got left. Hope. Reverend Ellis had been standing very quietly near the door. Now he moved slightly, just a shift in position, the way a man does when he's giving you as much privacy as a small room will allow. Adeline looked at Caleb Dawson, at the fine sweat on his forehead, at the hands pressed flat on his knees to keep them from shaking. At the eyes that were watching her, the way a man watches something he knows he doesn't have the right to ask for, and she thought about Lillian, who was 8 years old, and trying to protect a dying man from the knowledge of her fear. All right, she said, let's do this. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Reverend Ellis read the words in a calm and even voice, the same words he'd read over 100 times before, the same words that meant the same things they always meant. Even in a cold side room with no flowers and no guests, and a doctor standing near the door holding his bag because he might be needed at any moment. Caleb stood. He shouldn't have, doctor. Whitaker made a sound of protest, but he stood anyway and straightened to his full height, which was considerable, and he looked at Adeline when Ellis asked him to say his vows, and he said them clearly, with no stumbling and no looking away. And then he said, I need to say something that's not in the ceremony. Ellis nodded. Whitaker looked alarmed. Adeline went still. Caleb looked at her. If I live, he said, I will not hold you to this. I want you to know that. If I recover, if that happens, I'm not going to treat this like something that traps you. You'll have the choice to walk away, and I'll make it easy for you to do it. Whatever this is, it needs to be your choice, freely made. That matters to me. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected him to be, in the middle of his own dying, worried about whether she felt free. She said, and if you don't live, then I hope you'll stay, he said. For her, I'll stay, Adeline said. For her, and for whatever this was. She slid the plain ring his mother's, Dr. Whitaker had explained, which Caleb had pressed into the doctor's hand 3 days before onto her finger. And just like that, she was Adeline Dawson. She went out to the ranch that same afternoon in Dr. Whitaker's wagon, sitting upright on the seat with her hands in her lap and her good blue dress and everything she'd been able to pack into one traveling bag. Because the shop could wait, and the shop didn't need her, and she had said she would stay, and she was a woman who did what she said she would do. The Dawson Ranch was 4 miles outside of town, and she saw it for the first time with the afternoon light falling long and cold across it, the main house, the barn, the outbuildings, the fence lines running out toward the open land beyond. And all of it carrying that particular quality of a place that had been well built and well kept and had recently begun to come slightly apart at the edges. There were horses in the near field. There was a dog somewhere that started barking when the wagon came up the road. And standing on the front porch, holding onto one of the posts with both hands, was Lillian. She looked exactly as Adeline remembered. Small and serious and watchful, with dark hair braided neat, and Eleanor Dawson's eyes. Adeline had never met Eleanor Dawson, but she knew those eyes didn't come from Caleb, because Caleb's eyes were brown, and these were gray-green, wide and careful. She was watching the wagon come up the road with an expression on her face that Adeline understood immediately. She was waiting to find out whether this was going to be one more thing that hurt her, or one more thing that held. Dr. Whitaker helped Caleb down from the wagon. First there was a quiet battle about that, Caleb resisting the help, Whitaker insisting in his practical doctor's way. Caleb eventually conceding, with about as much grace as a man like him could manage, and then Adeline climbed down herself and stood in the front yard of the Dawson Ranch for the first time. Lillian had come down off the porch. She was standing about 10 feet away, looking at Adeline with those careful gray-green eyes. "You're Miss Mercer," the girl said. "Not a question." "I was," Adeline said. "I'm Mrs. Dawson now." Something complicated moved across Lillian's face. "Dr. Whitaker told me," she said. "He said Papa was getting married." "He did," he said. "You agreed to help." Lillian looked at her steadily. "Is that true? Or is that the story grown-ups make up, so things don't seem as sad as they are?" Adeline crouched down so she was level with the girl. She looked her straight in those gray-green eyes. "It's true," she said. "I'm here because I agreed to be here. And I'm not going to tell you that everything is going to be fine, because I don't know yet if it will. But I'm going to tell you something I do know." Lillian waited. "I keep my word," Adeline said. "That's something I can promise you." Something shifted in Lillian's face, not quite softening, not yet trust, but something adjusting, something recalibrating. "Like a door not fully opening but unlocking, okay," she said. "Do you want me to show you where things are?" "I'd appreciate that very much," Adeline said. She stayed. That first night she sat in the chair beside Caleb's bed while he slept badly, his breathing labored and wrong-sounding. And she watched the candle burn down, and she thought about the ring on her finger, and the girl sleeping in the next room, and the fact that she had walked into this house, a stranger this morning, and had absolutely no idea how to leave. She wasn't sure she wanted to. That was the strangest part. She'd expected to feel trapped. She'd expected to feel the way she'd felt since her parents died, like she was enduring something, pressing forward through it, because stopping wasn't an option, but never feeling anything that could honestly be called alive. Instead, she sat in that chair beside a dying man she'd married 4 hours ago, and she felt, for the first time in years, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She didn't know what to do with that. She kept her hand near his and listened to him breathe and waited for morning. He was worse the next day, and the day after that. The fever climbed in the second week until the doctor came out twice a day, and Adeline learned to change the dressings on the wound, a thing she'd never done before. A thing she'd had to ask Whitaker to show her with his hands over hers the first time, and she learned to recognize the difference between the sleep that was healing and the sleep that was losing ground. She cooked, she cleaned, she sat with Lillian in the evenings and helped the girl with her reading, because Lillian was smart sharply. Quickly smart in the way children are when they've spent a lot of time around adults and not enough time around other children, and she was behind in her letters because there hadn't been anyone consistent to sit with her. "Why are you doing this?" Lillian asked her one night, not looking up from the page. "Doing what? Teaching me. You don't have to. You have a lot to do." Adeline looked at the girl. "I'm doing it because it matters." "To who? And that's enough." Lillian looked up from the page. She looked at Adeline, the way she looked at things she was trying to understand, with a kind of careful, thorough attention. Then she looked back down at the page and kept reading. They didn't talk about the fact that Caleb was dying. They both knew it. It sat in the house with them like a third presence, heavy and patient, but they moved around it because there was nothing useful to say about it, and there was, on the other hand, quite a lot of useful work to get done. One of the ranch hands, a man named Pete, weathered and quiet and about 60 years old, came to Adeline on the third day with his hat in his hands and told her the cattle needed moving to the south pasture, and there were decisions that needed making, and he didn't know quite how to proceed. "Tell me what needs doing," she said, he told her. She made the decisions she could make, and asked Pete's opinion on the ones she couldn't, and Pete, who had clearly come to her expecting uncertainty, left with the particular settled look of a man who'd found something to lean on. She wrote letters to the lawyers she didn't have, asking Dr. Whitaker who she should contact. She wrote to a man named Harrison in Denver who came recommended, and she explained the situation in plain language and asked him what could be done to strengthen her position relative to Lillian's custody, should the worst happen. She didn't think about what the worst happening would mean for herself. She thought about Lillian. She thought about those gray-green eyes watching the wagon come up the road. "Are you really staying?" She hadn't asked it yet, not out loud. But Adeline heard it every day just the same. On the 8th night, Caleb's fever spiked so high that Adeline sent Pete galloping for Dr. Whitaker at 3 in the morning and sat beside the bed with a cold cloth and held Caleb's hand. Not talking about anything useful, just talked, steady and low, about the ranch and about Lillian and about nothing in particular. Because she'd read somewhere that the sound of a human voice was something people could hear even when they couldn't respond, and she believed it. and she was going to give him everything she had to give, even if it turned out to be not enough. Dr. Whitaker arrived before sunrise. He worked over Caleb for 2 hours while Adeline stood in the hall outside the bedroom door, with her arms crossed over her chest and her heart somewhere in her throat. When Whitaker came out, he looked at her for a long moment before he said anything. Then he said, "He's holding." Adeline put one hand against the wall. "Just holding," he said. "I'm not going to tell you more than that." "But he's still here, okay," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was very proud of that. She went back in and sat back down beside his bed and took his hand again and kept watch while the dawn came slow and gray through the window and the ranch woke up around them, horses moving in the field. The dog barking once, Pete's footsteps crossing the yard below. Lillian appeared in the doorway of the bedroom just after sunrise. She was still in her nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders, looking younger than she usually let herself look. "He's okay," she said. "He's still here," Adeline said. Lillian came into the room and stood beside the chair and looked at her father's still face for a long moment. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed, very carefully, the way a child sits when they're trying not to disturb anything. "I don't want him to go," she said. "I know," Adeline said. "I didn't want my mama to go either." She said it without looking up. And she went anyway. "But you stayed," Lillian said. She looked up. "Are you really staying, even no matter what?" Adeline looked at this child, this small, fierce, careful child who was trying so hard not to need things because needing things had only ever led to losing them. "Yes," she said. "I'm really staying, no matter what." Lillian looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once the way a child nods when they've decided to trust something they're still not entirely sure of. And she leaned, just slightly, against Adeline's arm. And Adeline sat very still and did not move and let her. Outside, the sun was coming up over the mountains. And inside the Dawson ranch house, a dying man breathed on through the morning, and the woman who had married him to save his daughter sat at his bedside holding his hand, and neither of them knew yet what was coming, but something in the room felt, despite everything, like the beginning of something rather than the end. Caleb's fever broke on the 9th morning, not dramatically. Not the way it happened in stories, where a man opens his eyes and announces he's better, and everyone in the room gasps with relief. It broke the way most real things happen quietly, almost without warning. Somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning, while Adeline was sitting in the chair beside his bed, with her chin dipping toward her chest, because she hadn't slept more than 2 consecutive hours in 4 days, and her body had finally started making decisions without consulting her. She felt his hand move, not a twitch. Not the involuntary kind of movement she'd seen before, the kind that meant nothing except that the body was still fighting. This was deliberate. His fingers closed around hers, slowly, like a man reaching for something he wasn't entirely sure was still there. Her head came up. Caleb Dawson was looking at her. His eyes were open, fully open, and they were clear, not the glazed, unfocused look she'd been seeing for days, but actually clear, actually present, actually in the room with her, in a way he hadn't been since, before the fever climbed to its worst. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said in a voice that came out raw and rough as gravel, "You're still here." "I said I would be," Adeline said. He blinked slowly. His gaze moved around the room, taking in the familiar walls, the window with the gray pre-dawn beyond it, the candle burned nearly to nothing on the side table. Then it came back to her. "How long?" 9 days, she said. Something moved across his face, disbelief maybe. Or something deeper than that. Something she didn't quite have a name for yet. "Lillian," he said, "sleeping, she's fine, she's been fine." Adeline leaned forward slightly. "How do you feel?" He seemed to take stock of that question the way a man does when he's genuinely uncertain of the answer carefully, from the inside out. "Like I lost a fight," he said at last. "You won," she said. He looked at her again. "Did I?" She didn't answer that right away. She reached over and pressed the back of her hand to his forehead, the way she'd been doing 100 times a day for the past week. And this time what she felt was different. Cool, Almost normal, the fire that had been burning through him for days was finally retreating. "Your fever's broken," she said. He closed his eyes for a moment. "Open them again." "Go get some sleep," he said. "I'm fine." "Miss Mercer." He stopped, corrected himself quietly. "Adeline, go sleep. I'll be here when you wake up." There was something in the way he said it, simple, direct, without performance, that cut right through her composure. She'd been holding herself together for 9 days by the sheer force of not letting herself stop, and now here was this man, in the first real moment of his survival, telling her she was allowed to rest. She almost didn't know what to do with that. "I'll get Dr. Whitaker in the morning," she said. "In the morning," he agreed. Go. She went. She slept for 4 hours in the small room Lillian had shown her on the first day, the one that had been used for storage but had a narrow bed against the wall. And when she woke up, the sun was fully up, and she could hear Lillian's voice coming from Caleb's room down the hall, fast and breathless, the way children talk when they have too many things to say and not enough patience to slow down for any of them. She lay still for a moment and listened to the sound of that a little girl's voice running on, and beneath it, low and quiet, Caleb's voice answering, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had not heard this house sound like this in all the 9 days she'd been here. It had been a house holding its breath, now it was exhaling. She got up. She washed her face, pinned her hair back, and went down the hall and knocked on the open door of Caleb's room. Lillian was sitting on the edge of his bed, the same place she'd sat that morning with her hair loose, trying not to take up too much space, except this morning she was sitting straight, and her eyes were bright, and she was in the middle of a about a mare in the east field who'd gotten out 2 days ago, and Pete had spent an entire afternoon chasing her before she'd come back on her own. Caleb was propped against the pillows. He still looked wrong, pale, diminished, the healthy outdoor color of him completely gone, but his eyes were following Lillian with an expression so raw and uncomplicated that Adeline stopped in the doorway without meaning to. He looked like a man who'd been told he was going to die and had then been handed back his life. He looked like he didn't quite know what to do with that yet, but he was holding on to it with everything he had. Lillian turned and saw Adeline in the doorway. "He's awake," she announced, as though this were news. "I see that," Adeline said. "He knew your name," Lillian said. "He asked about you first thing." Caleb looked at Adeline with an expression that might have been embarrassed if he'd had the energy for embarrassment. "I asked if you'd gotten any sleep," he said. "That's all." "He asked if you were okay," Lillian corrected, with the particular accuracy of children who have no patience for adults softening things. Twice, Adeline looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at his hands. "Well," Adeline said, and came the rest of the way into the room. Dr. Whitaker arrived before noon and stood at Caleb's bedside with an expression that moved through several stages: professional assessment, genuine surprise, and finally something that looked a lot like relief. Though doctors in 1884 didn't often say that word out loud. "I'll be honest with you," Whitaker said, sitting back in the chair. "I wasn't sure I'd be having this conversation." "Here we are," Caleb said. "Here we are," Whitaker agreed. He looked at Adeline, who was standing near the door. "However you managed it, Mrs. Dawson, I think you may have had something to do with it." "He did it himself," Adeline said. Caleb looked at her when she said it. She didn't look back at him right away, but she felt it. The doctor left with instructions: rest, no exertion, specific care for the wound still healing in his side, food in small amounts and then larger amounts as the days went on. He'd be back in 3 days and then again after that, and Caleb was not, under any circumstances, to get on a horse, lift anything heavier than a water glass, or argue with his wife. That last part was delivered with a dry look in Adeline's direction, and she chose not to respond to it. The days that followed were different in kind from the 9 that had come before. Before, the house had been organized around a crisis. Everything: the cooking, the cleaning, the ranch decisions, the letters, the nights in the chair, had been oriented toward a single point of focus: which was keeping Caleb Dawson alive and keeping Lillian steady while they found out if that was going to be possible. Now the crisis had shifted. Caleb was alive, and the house had to figure out what it was without the emergency to hold it together. Adeline discovered, in those first days, that this was in some ways harder. Because when it was a crisis, she'd known what she was doing there. She was there because someone needed her, and she'd said she would be. Clear, simple, the kind of purpose that doesn't ask any questions of itself. But now Caleb was sitting up in bed asking Pete detailed questions about the south fence line, and Lillian was sitting at the kitchen table working through her reading with a steadiness that had become almost habitual. And the ranch was running with the kind of quiet competence that Pete and the two younger hands provided without much guidance. And Adeline found herself standing in her own kitchen, the one she'd taken over completely in the past 9 days, and asking herself a question she hadn't allowed before. What are you now? She was his wife on paper. She was the woman who had kept his house and raised his daughter for 9 days and made decisions about his cattle and written letters to lawyers in Denver about protecting his child. But they had spoken, 100 words to each other before she'd signed that paper. She knew his name and the sound of his voice and the way he looked when he was fighting for his life, but she didn't know his history, his habits, what he ate when he had a choice, what made him laugh, what kept him up at night beyond the obvious. She was married to a stranger who was not dying anymore. And that changed everything about what she was doing here. She was thinking about exactly that, standing at the kitchen counter, with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand when she heard his voice from the doorway. "You're going to have to talk to me eventually." She turned around. Caleb was standing in the kitchen doorway. He was actually dressed, in trousers and a shirt he'd managed himself. Though it was slightly wrong at the collar, the way it gets when a man has done his buttons without quite enough strength in his hands, and he was leaning one shoulder against the frame in a way that was probably casual and was also probably necessary. "You're not supposed to be out of bed," she said. "I've been in bed for 12 days. "I'm going insane," Dr. Whitaker said. Dr. Whitaker also thought I'd be dead by now, so I'm taking his predictions with some allowance. He looked at her steadily. "Can I sit down?" She nodded at the chair at the table. He crossed the kitchen slowly, with the particular careful gait of a man reminding himself that his body needs managing, and sat down and put both hands on the table and looked at her. "You've been avoiding me," he said. "I've been letting you rest." "You've been avoiding me," he said again, evenly, not as an accusation. She turned back to the counter and poured the cold coffee out and refilled the cup and brought it to the table and sat down across from him. Because if this was going to happen, it was going to happen properly. "All right," she said. "Say what you want to say." He wrapped both hands around the cup. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. "How are you doing?" That was not what she'd expected. "I'm fine," she said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. "I asked how you're doing," he said. "Not how the ranch is doing, not how Lillian is doing." "You. How are you, Adeline?" Nobody had asked her that. Not in 9 days. Not in the 2 years since her parents died. Honestly, because the kind of asking that was waiting for an actual answer was different from the kind of asking that was just courtesy. And she'd gotten a lot of the courtesy kind, and none of the other. She wasn't entirely prepared for it. "I'm managing," she said. "I imagine you are." He looked at her with a directness that she was starting to understand, was just how he was not rude, not challenging, just straight, the way some people are straight without trying to be. "I imagine you've been managing everything. I heard you talking to Pete about the south pasture. I heard you telling Lillian's letters tutor to come back on Thursdays. I know you wrote to Harrison in Denver. Someone had to." "Yes," he said, "someone had to, and that someone was you." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm aware of what you've done here. I want to make sure you know that I'm aware of it." "You don't owe me anything," she said. "We made a clear agreement. We made an agreement under circumstances that made it impossible to be fair," he said. "And now the circumstances are different, and I think we should talk about what that means." She looked at him across the table. What do you think it means? He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that was thinking, not evasion. I don't know yet, he said. Honestly, I'm still getting used to the idea that I'm alive. He said it without self-pity, just as a fact. But I want you to know, whatever you decide you want out of this, going forward, I'll respect it. If you want to go back to your shop, I'll make sure you're taken care of. If you want to stay.
He stopped.
If you want to stay, then I'd like to figure out what that looks like. Together. He seemed to search for the right word. Without pretense, Adeline looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Can I ask you something?" "Ask, what are you actually afraid of right now?" He didn't hesitate. "Losing her again," he said, "not to death." To them. She understood immediately, the Hartwells. The letter that had come while he was unconscious, and that she'd intercepted and dealt with herself, writing back to Harrison in Denver, with the details, and asking him to advise. "I know," she said, "I've been handling it. I know you have." He looked at her steadily. "And that's exactly the problem," she frowned. "Not a problem you caused," he said quickly. "A problem that exists. You've been handling things that are mine to handle, because I couldn't. And now I can, or I'm going to be able to soon. But we're in a situation where the lines aren't clear. Where you've done things that a wife would do, and I've been in no position to reciprocate anything. And I want to be honest about that, because I think pretending it isn't complicated is going to make it more complicated." He looked at his cup. "I've never been good at pretending things are simpler than they are." "Neither have I," Adeline said. He looked up. "I stayed because I said I would," she said. "And because the child needed someone steady. That's true, and it's the whole truth. But I'm not going to tell you the other part isn't also true, which is that somewhere in the last 9 days I stopped thinking about leaving." She held his gaze. "I don't know what that means either. But I'm not going to pretend otherwise." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, one of the horses made a sound in the field, and Pete's voice answered it with a low, indistinct word. And somewhere above them in the house they could hear Lillian moving around in her room with the particular audible energy of a child who has been sitting still for too long. "All right," Caleb said. "All right," she said. Neither of them said anything else about it. But something had settled. 3 days later, the letter arrived. Pete brought it up from town, and Adeline saw it in his face before she saw it in the envelope, the particular careful blankness of a man trying not to show that he thinks something is bad news. The return address was a legal firm in Denver, not Harrison's. Another one. She opened it at the kitchen table before Caleb was up, read it twice, and then sat with her hands flat on the table for a full minute before she made any decisions about what to do next. The Hartwells had filed. Not just a letter this time, not just noise and implication. An actual filing with an actual court date 4 weeks away arguing that Caleb Dawson was an unfit guardian on the grounds of his recent illness, that the child had been left in the care of a stranger, and that the marriage itself was a fraud of convenience that deserved to be examined. They'd found a judge willing to hear it. They'd found witnesses, she didn't know who yet, but the letter implied they existed. That the marriage had been arranged under duress and was not a genuine union. And they had, somehow, obtained a statement from someone in Willow Creek. She didn't know who yet. She read that part 3 more times, trying to figure out what it meant and who it could possibly be. And she was still sitting there when she heard Caleb's step in the hallway. He came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw her face. "What?" he said. She handed him the letter. She watched him read it. She watched his jaw tighten on the second paragraph and his hands go very still on the third. He read it all the way through without speaking, and then he set it down on the table and looked at it for a moment, and then he looked at her. "Someone in town," he said. "Someone gave them a statement." "Yes. Who? I don't know yet." He was quiet. She could see him thinking, not panicking, not erupting, but genuinely thinking. Working through it the way a man works, through a problem that matters too much for emotion to be useful. "Harrison," he said. "I'll write to him today. We need more than a letter. We need to meet with him." He looked up. "Can you get word to him about the court date?" "Already planning it." He looked at her for a moment. "Adeline, "Thank you," he said, "for already planning it." She nodded and got up to start the letter. It was Lillian who told them who had spoken to the Hartwells. Not because she'd been snooping, because she'd heard something in town. On the one afternoon Adeline had taken her in for her reading lesson, and she'd turned it over in her mind, the way children turn things over before they decide whether to bring it to the adults. She brought it to Adeline. "Mrs. Gaines said something," Lillian said. She was standing in the kitchen doorway with an expression that was trying hard to be neutral. "To Mr. Cutler at the post office. I wasn't supposed to hear, but I heard anyway. Bertha Gaines." Adeline had seen that narrowed look on the boarding house step when she'd walked past with Dr. Whitaker on the morning of the wedding. "What did she say?" Adeline asked carefully. "She said that you married Papa for the property." Lillian's voice was very even, the way it got when she was controlling something harder than evenness. "She said everyone in town knew it." She stopped. "She said you weren't really family. You were just a woman who saw an opportunity." The kitchen was very quiet. "And what do you think?" Adeline asked. Lillian looked at her, straight at her, those gray-green eyes. "I think she's wrong," she said, "because I was there. And I know what I saw." Adeline looked at this child, this fierce, careful, loyal little girl, and felt something move through her that she couldn't entirely name. Something that had a lot of different things in it. Gratitude and anger, and something that was startlingly close to love, the kind that doesn't ask permission. "You're right," she said. "She's wrong." Lillian nodded once, satisfied. Then she said, "What are we going to do about it?" "We, not what are you going to do? Not what is Papa going to do?" "We," Adeline looked at her and said, "we're going to fight." Caleb was on his feet by the end of the second week. Not full strength, not anywhere close, but on his feet, which was more than the doctor had planned for, and doing it with the kind of stubborn incremental determination that Adeline was beginning to understand was simply how he was built. He didn't recover dramatically. He recovered the way he did everything. She was learning steadily, methodically, without announcement. He started joining them at the table for meals. The first time he came to the table, sat down across from her and Lillian and passed the bread, and made a comment about Pete's plantain for the fence repair. It was so ordinary and so unexpected that Adeline had to look down at her plate for a moment. Lillian noticed, and being Lillian, did not comment. But she caught Adeline's eye across the table, with a look that said very clearly, "I see that too." They fell into a rhythm. Not an easy rhythm. Not the comfortable kind that comes from years of knowing each other, but a functional one, the kind you build deliberately out of shared work and shared purpose, because you don't have the luxury of going slow. Adeline ran the house. Caleb managed the ranch decisions from wherever he happened to be standing, which shifted gradually from the bedroom to the kitchen to the barn door, to the barn itself as the weeks moved. Lillian went to her lessons on Thursdays and came home and told them both about it, in more detail than either of them had specifically requested. They talked. That was the part Adeline hadn't expected. She'd expected a kind of civil arrangement, the sort of thing you could maintain at a polite distance. Instead, she found that Caleb Dawson, once he was upright and breathing without labor, was the kind of man who talked. Not to fill silence, he was comfortable enough with silence. But when he had something to say, he said it directly, and he had opinions about things, and he was interested in her opinions about things. And he asked questions that weren't the kind that led somewhere, but the kind that were genuinely curious about the answer. He asked about her parents, she told him. He asked about her work, the sewing, the shop, the particular skill of it, and he asked actual questions, not the polite nodding kind, but the kind that followed from listening to what she'd said, rather than just waiting for his turn. She asked about Eleanor. He was quiet for a moment, and then he answered, and she appreciated that he didn't try to protect her from it. Eleanor had been his word real. Smart, particular, occasionally exasperating in the way that people who know exactly what they want can be exasperating. They'd been happy. Then the fever came in the third summer, and that was the end of that. And Lillian had gone quit for a year, in a way that had frightened him more than his own grief. She came back, Adeline said. She did, he said. Mostly. He looked at her. She came back more when you came. Adeline didn't know what to do with that. She kept her face neutral and changed the subject. But she thought about it later. The lawyer Harrison arrived from Denver 12 days before the court date and sat at the kitchen table with them for 3 hours, and what he laid out was both better and worse than Adeline had expected. Better, the case wasn't as strong as the Hartwells thought. Their central claim that the marriage was fraudulent was difficult to prove in the face of witnesses who'd seen the ceremony, the doctor's testimony, the preacher's testimony, and the obvious evidence of Adeline's actual residence and actual participation in the running of the household. Worse, they had Bertha Gaines. And apparently Bertha Gaines, when she decided to say something, said it with a conviction and a certainty that a judge was going to have to reckon with. She's going to testify that she saw you agree to the marriage under financial inducement, Harrison said, looking at Adeline. She's going to say she witnessed a conversation between you and Dr. Whitaker where money was mentioned. No such conversation happened, Adeline said. I believe you, Harrison said. The question is whether the judge will. He looked at them both. The strongest thing you have is the child. Lillian's testimony, if she's willing to give it. She's 8, Caleb said flatly. She's 8 and she's articulate, and she clearly has a strong attachment to Mrs. Dawson, Harrison said. I've had judges moved by less. Caleb looked at Adeline. Adeline looked at Caleb. Something passed between them in that look, that they hadn't talked about the question of whether it was right to put a child through that, to ask her to stand in a courtroom and defend the people who were supposed to be protecting her. Let me talk to her, Adeline said. Harrison left them with papers to review, and Adeline went to find Lillian. She found her in the yard, sitting on the fence rail watching the horses the way she did when she had too much on her mind, which was the way she and her father were alike, in a way neither of them seemed to see about themselves. Adeline climbed up and sat on the rail beside her. They watched the horses for a moment. You're going to ask me something hard, Lillian said. How do you know? You only sit here when something is hard. Adeline looked at her. When else have I sat here? Lillian thought about it. The night after the letter came, she said. And the time Pete told you about the north fence, and you knew it was going to cost more than you had. She paused. You sit here and look at the horses, and then you figure something out. Adeline was quiet for a moment. The court hearing, she said. I know about it. Your father and I are trying to figure out. I'll do it, Lillian said. I haven't asked yet. I know you haven't. The girl looked at her steadily. I'll do it. I've been thinking about it since the letter came. If they want me to tell them the truth, I'll tell them the truth. Something in her face shifted, just slightly. The truth is that you stayed. The truth is that you taught me to read better, and you helped Pete with the south pasture, and you held Papa's hand when he was sick. She looked straight ahead at the horses. The truth is that this is my home and you're my family, and I'm not going to be quiet about that because some woman in town told a story. Adeline sat on the fence rail and looked at this girl. This fierce, clear-eyed, loyal girl who had been bracing herself against loss for so long that she'd turned it into a kind of strength. You don't have to be scared, Adeline said. Whatever happens in that courtroom, you're not doing it alone. Lillian looked at her. I know, she said simply. Then she went back to watching the horses. Adeline sat there a moment longer. And then she thought about Bertha Gaines and her narrowed eyes and her story, about a woman who married for property, and she felt something harden in haste that wasn't quite anger, but was something in the same family. She was not going to lose this, not the house, not the ranch. Not the girl sitting on the fence rail with her hair, catching the afternoon light. Not this family that she hadn't looked for and hadn't expected and had somehow in the space of 3 weeks become the realest thing in her life. She climbed down from the fence and went back inside. She had a letter to write, and then she decided she was going to start preparing for the most important fight of her life. The letter Adeline wrote that night was 3 pages long. She wrote it to Harrison first, detailing everything she remembered about the morning doctor. Whitaker had come to her door every word, every pause, every specific thing that had been said and what had not been said, because she understood now that the Hartwells were going to try to make that morning into something it wasn't. And the only defense against a fabricated story was a true one told with enough precision that there was no room left for invention. Then she wrote a second letter. This one she didn't tell Caleb about. Not yet. She wrote it to Reverend Ellis, asking him to write down, in his own hand, exactly what he had witnessed in that side room on the morning of the wedding. Not a summary, not a general confirmation. Every specific detail, the time, the light, who was present, what was said, what Caleb had added that wasn't in the ceremony, and what Adeline had answered. She asked him to sign it and have it notarized and send it to Harrison directly. Then she sat back and thought about Bertha Gaines. Bertha Gaines had been in Willow Creek for 30 years. She ran the boarding house on the north end of Main Street, and she had an opinion about everything and everyone. And she delivered those opinions with the calm certainty of someone who had decided long ago that being confident was the same as being right. Adeline had never had a problem with the woman before they'd exchanged pleasantries, done occasional business, existed in the same small town the way people do when they don't particularly seek each other out, but don't avoid each other either. But Bertha Gaines had watched her walk past with Dr. Whitaker on the morning of the wedding, and she had narrowed her eyes and drawn a conclusion, and then she had made that conclusion available to the people who wanted to use it. The question was why. Adeline thought about that for a long time. She thought about it the next morning when she was making breakfast, and Caleb came into the kitchen still moving carefully, but with more steadiness than the day before. She thought about it while she listened to him, and Pete talking outside about the fence repair. She was still thinking about it when Lillian came downstairs and sat at the table and looked at her with those perceptive gray-green eyes. "You figured something out," Lillian said. "Not yet," Adeline said. "But you're close." Adeline looked at her. "What makes you say that?" "You get a certain look," Lillian said, "like you're almost somewhere but not quite." Adeline set the pan down and looked at the girl properly. "Lillian, did Mrs. Gaines ever have any dealings with your mother's family, the Hartwells?" Lillian thought about it, genuinely considered it, the way she did things, taking her time. "She stayed at the boarding house," she said, "when they came for Mama's funeral. Mrs. Hartwell and her son, they stayed there 4 days." She paused. "I remember because Mrs. Gaines came to the burial, and she stood very close to Mrs. Hartwell the whole time. I thought it was strange because she didn't know my mama." There it was. Adeline picked the pan back up. "Thank you," she said. "Did that help?" "Yes," Adeline said. "It did." She told Harrison that afternoon when she sent the letter, added a postscript at the bottom, 3 sentences, about Bertha Gaines and the Hartwell funeral and the 4 days at the boarding house. She didn't know exactly what it meant in a legal sense. But she knew it meant something, and she trusted Harrison to know what to do with it. What she didn't expect was what happened 2 days later. She was in the yard with Lillian, helping her practice the letters she'd been struggling with. The girl sitting on the porch step with the primer open on her knees when a wagon came up the road from town. Not Pete's wagon, a finer one, with 2 horses and a driver she didn't recognize, and in the back, sitting upright and dressed in the kind of clothing that announced itself before you were close enough to read faces, was a woman. Margaret Hartwell. Adeline had never met her, but she knew her instantly, the way you know certain people before they've said a word, by the set of the shoulders, the angle of the chin. The particular quality of someone who has never in her life walked into a room and wondered whether she belonged there. She was perhaps 60, handsome in a severe way, with dark hair gone silver and eyes that were startlingly the same gray-green as Lillian's. Eleanor's mother. Lillian had gone completely still beside her. Adeline put her hand on the girl's shoulder, one brief press, and stood up. Margaret Hartwell stepped down from the wagon without waiting for the driver's help and walked toward the house with the unhurried certainty of someone who has already decided the outcome of what they're doing. She stopped about 6 feet from Adeline. She looked at her. Then she looked at Lillian. Then she looked back at Adeline. "Mrs. Dawson," she said, and the title came out with a very precise inflection that communicated exactly how much weight she gave it. "Mrs. Hartwell," Adeline said, "I'd like to speak with my granddaughter." "You're welcome to speak with her right here," Adeline said. Something sharpened in the older woman's eyes. "I meant privately." "I'm sure you did," Adeline said pleasantly. "Lillian, do you want to speak with your grandmother privately?" She asked it directly, to the girl, not as a formality but as an actual question, and she kept her voice neutral, because she was not going to put the child in the middle of something she hadn't chosen to be in. Lillian looked at Margaret Hartwell. The girl's face was doing something complicated, something that had old grief in it, and recognition, and the particular wariness of a child who has learned that love and ownership can look the same from a distance. "No," Lillian said quietly, "I'd like Adeline to stay." Margaret Hartwell absorbed that. Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes shifted. "Very well." She looked at Adeline. "May we go inside?" "We can talk here," Adeline said. She saw a flicker of something in the older woman's face. Not anger, she was too controlled for visible anger. But the awareness that she was not, in this situation, in charge. "All right," she said. She looked at Lillian. "How are you, child?" "I'm fine, ma'am," Lillian said. Careful, polite. The voice of a child who has been taught manners and is using them as a shield. "You look thin. I'm healthy. You look like you need proper care." "I have proper care," Lillian said. And her voice had gotten very quiet and very even in the way it did when she was working hard at something. Margaret Hartwell looked at Adeline. "I want you to understand something," she said. And now the pleasantry was gone, and what was underneath it was plain. "I am not your enemy. I am a grandmother who lost her daughter and who has been watching her grandchild raised in circumstances that are insufficient. I am doing what any person in my position would do. You're doing what any person in your position who has lawyers and money would do," Adeline said. "Those aren't the same thing." The older woman looked at her steadily. "You're a seamstress from town who married a dying man she barely knew. You are not this child's mother." "No," Adeline said. "I'm not. Her mother was a woman named Eleanor who loved her and raised her and died too young, and Lillian knows that, and I've never pretended otherwise." She held the woman's gaze. "But I'm here. I was here when her father was fighting for his life. I was here every morning and every night, and every difficult thing in between. And I'm going to keep being here. So if you'd like to have a conversation about what's actually best for Lillian, I'm willing to have that conversation. But if you've come here to tell me what I am and am not, you've wasted the trip." The yard was very quiet. Margaret Hartwell looked at her for a long moment. And then slowly she looked at Lillian. "Do you know who I am?" she asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking, something stripped back in it. "You're my grandmother," Lillian said. "You're my mama's mama." "Do you remember me?" "I remember you at the funeral," Lillian said. "You cried. I remember thinking that you must have loved her very much." Something moved across Margaret Hartwell's face that was entirely different from everything that had come before it. Something that had nothing to do with lawyers or court dates or the word insufficient. "I did," she said. Her voice had changed. "I loved her more than yes." "I did." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Lillian said carefully, "I think you miss her." "Yes," the older woman said. "So do I," Lillian said. Every day. Something in Margaret Hartwell's face fractured. Just for a second. Just long enough to see what was behind it, which was a woman who had lost her daughter and was trying to hold on to the last piece of her in the only way she knew, which was by controlling the situation, because control was the thing she knew how to do. Adeline watched all of this and said nothing. The older woman composed herself. The control came back, smooth and practiced. She looked at Adeline. "We will see each other in court," she said. "I expect so," Adeline said. She turned and walked back to her wagon, and got in with the same composed certainty she'd arrived with, and the driver turned the horses, and they went back down the road toward town. Adeline and Lillian stood in the yard and watched them go. Then Lillian said, "She's not as scary as I thought she'd be." No, Adeline said. She's just sad, yes. Lillian looked up at her. Does that change anything? Adeline considered that honestly, because Lillian deserved honest answers. It changes how I feel about her, she said. It doesn't change what I'm going to do. Lillian nodded. That seemed right to her. They went back inside. Caleb had watched the whole thing from the window. He didn't say that he was sitting at the kitchen table when they came in, working through some papers about the ranch accounts, but Adeline could tell from the particular quality of his stillness that he'd been watching. Margaret Hartwell, he said. Yes, she came herself. She did. He was quiet for a moment. How was Lillian? Extraordinary, Adeline said, and she meant it. He looked up at her. Something in his face that she was learning to read, the way it went very still when something mattered. The way the stillness was its own kind of expression. And you? He asked. I'm fine. He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked back at his papers. Sit down for a minute, he said. She sat. He didn't say anything immediately. He finished what he was looking at in the papers, made a mark somewhere, and then set the pen down and looked at her properly. I should have been out there, he said. You weren't well enough. I'm aware of that. I'm telling you it bothers me. That's fair. I'm also telling you he stopped. Started again what you said to her about being here. About not pretending otherwise regarding Eleanor. He looked at her. That was right. That was exactly right. And I couldn't have said it better, and I need you to know I'm aware of that. Adeline looked at him. You keep thanking me, she said. You don't need to keep thanking me. I'm not thanking you, he said. I'm telling you that I see you. There's a difference. She didn't have a ready answer to that. She looked at the table instead, at his hands resting on the papers, at the fading scar along his left hand, where she'd seen him favor it in cold mornings. Caleb, she said. Yeah, we're going to win this. He looked at her. I don't know how yet, she said. But I'm not going to let them take her. He held her gaze for a long moment. I know, he said. I need you to know it like it's real, she said. Not like something I'm saying. Actually know it. Something settled in his face. I know, he said again, and this time it was different. She nodded and got up to start dinner. The 2 weeks before the court date moved fast and slow at the same time, the way time does when you're both dreading and preparing for something, when every day is full of things to do but the thing at the end of it is sitting on every moment. Harrison came out twice more. He sat with them both and went through what to expect, what the Hartwells' lawyers would likely argue, what their witnesses would say, and how to counter it. He met with Pete, who was willing to testify about the ranch and about Caleb's character, and about the ways the household had functioned in the weeks after Adeline arrived. He met with Dr. Whitaker, who was the clearest and most credible voice they had on the circumstances of the marriage. The notarized letter from Reverend Ellis arrived, and Harrison read it and said it was good. Very good, but Bertha Gaines was still the problem. The connection to the Hartwells was real, and Harrison had confirmed it. Josephine Hartwell, Margaret's daughter-in-law, had indeed stayed at the boarding house, and had indeed developed what appeared to be an ongoing correspondence with Bertha Gaines, which gave the court the context for the testimony but didn't negate it. She's going to say what she's going to say, Harrison told them. The best we can do is make sure the truth around it is louder. That was where Adeline had an idea. It came to her on a Tuesday evening when she was walking back from the general store in town, and she passed two women she knew, Martha Ellison and Clara Pruitt, old Mrs. Pruitt's daughter-in-law, who stopped her to ask how Caleb was doing and how things were going with the hearing, and in their voices and in their faces was something she hadn't expected. Genuine concern. Not the rubbernecking kind, not the kind that was really just hunger for detail to carry home and repeat at dinner. Actual worry, for Caleb, for Lillian, and she realized with a start for her. We've been thinking about you all, Martha said. All of us have. It doesn't seem right what that family is trying to do. It doesn't sit well, Clara agreed. Caleb Dawson has been in this valley his whole life. We know who he is. Adeline looked at them. She thought about what Harrison had said. Make the truth louder. Would you be willing, she said carefully, to say that, officially, to the court? They looked at each other. Then Martha said, "You tell me when and where." By the time she got back to the ranch, she had 4 more names. Women who had watched Caleb Dawson be a decent man for years, and who had no reason to say otherwise and every reason to say so plainly, to anyone who asked, in whatever setting required it. She told Caleb that night. He was sitting in the chair by the window he'd moved his evenings there, the chair that looked out toward the field, and she'd started to understand it was where he thought, and she told him what she'd done and watched his face go through something she'd seen before on him. That particular quality of a man who has not expected something and doesn't quite know what to do with receiving it. "You went to town and you asked people to testify for us," he said. "I went to town and they offered," she said. "I just asked them to make it official." He was quiet for a moment. "How many 4 so far?" "Possibly 2 more. He looked at her for a long moment. "Adeline, it's what needed doing." "I know." He looked at her. "I know it is." He turned back toward the window. "I've been sitting here thinking about what this hearing is going to look like. Thinking about Lillian up there, in front of that judge. Thinking about what it cost her." "It cost her," Adeline said. "But she's willing. I know she's willing. That's not the same as it being right to let her." "No," she agreed, "it isn't." She sat down. "But I think she needs to do it. Not for the case, or not only for the case. I think she needs to say the thing out loud. In a place where people have to listen." She paused. "She's been protecting everyone around her for years. She's been quiet and careful and so afraid of taking up too much space. I think this might be the first time she gets to say clearly, in front of people, this is mine and I'm not giving it up." Caleb was silent. "She's not a piece of property in a custody case," Adeline said. "She's a person who knows her own mind, and I think she should be allowed to use it." He looked at her for a long moment. "You know her well," he said quietly. "She lets me," Adeline said. He looked back at the window. "All right," he said. "All right. There was one more thing that happened before the court date. One more thing that Adeline hadn't seen coming, and that changed the shape of everything. It happened 5 days before the hearing. She was at the table in the evening, going through the letters from Harrison one more time, making sure she hadn't missed anything, when Caleb came in from checking on the horses, and sat down across from her without saying anything. And she looked up and saw that something had happened. "What?" she said. He set a folded piece of paper on the table. She opened it. It was a letter, not from a lawyer. Not from the Hartwells. The handwriting was careful and slightly formal, the handwriting of someone who didn't write letters often. It was from Margaret Hartwell. She read it. It was 2 paragraphs. The first said that she had retained the right, through her lawyers, to proceed with the hearing, and that she intended to do so. The second said something else entirely. It said, "I came to that ranch believing I knew what I would find. I did not find what I expected. I am not prepared to say more than that, but I am asking you to understand that my intention has never been to cause Lillian pain." Adeline read it twice, then she looked up at Caleb. "Where did this come from?" "It was with the Post-Pete, brought up from town today." He looked at it. "I don't know what to make of it." "She's not withdrawing," Adeline said. "No, but she's saying something, in between the lines." "Yeah." He looked at her. "What do you think it means?" Adeline thought about the woman who had stood in the yard and fractured, just for a second, when an 8-year-old girl said, "So do I." She thought about what Lillian had said afterward. "She's not scary, she's just sad. I think it means she's not entirely certain she's doing the right thing," Adeline said. "And I think she wanted someone to know that." She looked at Caleb. "I don't think it changes the outcome. I think her lawyers are still going to fight." But I think she might listen," Adeline said slowly. "If she heard the right thing from the right person." Caleb looked at her. "You want to talk to her?" "Not me," Adeline said. She looked at him. He was very still for a moment. "Before the hearing," Adeline said. "Not in the courtroom. On our terms, in our space, with you present. Let Lillian talk to her. Just talk. Not to persuade her legally. Harrison says it won't affect the case one way or another, unless Margaret actually withdraws." But if this woman is carrying grief and guilt, and she's using a court case to manage it because she doesn't know what else to do. She stopped. Maybe someone just needs to talk to her like she's a person. Caleb looked at her for a long time. You think Lillian would want to, he said. I think Lillian already knows what she wants to say. Adeline looked at him. I think she's been waiting for someone to let her. He was quiet. She waited. She'd learned that he needed space to think things through, and that pressing into that space didn't help, so she let it sit. After a long moment, he said, You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Really looked at her, the direct, unhurried way he had. Someone who would do what was needed and hold themselves apart from it, he said. Keep the right amount of distance, not get too invested. And instead you're in it, he said, completely. Like it's yours. It is mine, she said. I decided that. The air between them was very still. Yeah, Caleb said softly. I think you did. She looked back at the letter. Do you want me to write to her? I'll do it. She looked up surprised. She's Eleanor's mother, he said. The letter should come from me. He paused. Will you help me with it? Adeline looked at this particular man who had gone from stranger to husband, to something she didn't have a name for yet, who was asking her to help him write a letter to the grand-agrère of the child they were both fighting to keep, and she thought that whatever she'd been expecting from this life, it was not this. It was not this exact combination of difficulty and rightness, this weight that somehow didn't feel like a burden. Yes, she said. Get some paper. They wrote it together at the kitchen table, the candle burning down between them, his handwriting and her words, and when it was done, it said something simple and true, that they were inviting Margaret Hartwell to the ranch, one more time. Without lawyers, without an agenda, just so she could sit with her granddaughter the way a grandmother ought to be able to sit with a grandchild. That, whatever happened in the courtroom afterward, was the courtroom's business. But this was family's business, and they were offering it. They sent it with Pete the next morning. The reply came the following afternoon. One line, I will come Friday, 4 days before the court date. Adeline read it and set it down on the table and looked at Caleb, who was watching her with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the way he held himself when he was bracing for something. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that this could go badly. That Margaret Hartwell could come on Friday and leave more entrenched than ever. That they could be handing their opponent a look at their hand before the most important card game of their lives. But they'd made the call, and Adeline had learned, in the weeks since she'd walked into this house, that the calls worth making were rarely the safe ones. She went to find Lillian. The girl was in her room, sitting on her bed, with a book open on her knees, that she clearly wasn't reading because she looked up the moment Adeline appeared in the doorway with a particular alertness of someone who has been waiting. She's coming, Lillian said. Not a question, Adeline said. How did you know? I heard the wagon, Lillian said. And I saw your face when Pete brought the letter. Adeline leaned against the doorframe. You okay? Lillian thought about it. Actually thought about it, which Adeline appreciated. I think so, she said. I've been thinking about what I want to say to her. You don't have to say anything you don't want to. I know. Lillian looked at her. But there are things I want her to know, she paused. About Mama. About what I remember. 'Cause she stopped. Restarted. I think nobody talks to her about Mama anymore. I think that's part of why she's the way she is. Adeline looked at this child. This extraordinary child. I think you might be right, she said. Lillian nodded, satisfied. Then she said, Will you be there when she comes? If you want me to be. I want you to be, Lillian said. Not to say anything, just to be there. I can do that, Adeline said. Lillian went back to her book, or the pretense of it. Adeline stood in the doorway a moment longer, looking at her, and thought about what Caleb had said. You're in it, completely, like it's yours. She thought about a morning not so long ago when she'd signed her name to a marriage certificate while a man bled through his bandages in the next room, and how she'd done it because a child needed someone who would stay. She was still here. She was more here than she'd ever been anywhere. And in 4 days, she was going to walk into a courtroom and make sure the people who thought they could take that away understood exactly how wrong they were. Margaret Hartwell arrived on Friday morning in the same fine wagon, with the same composed posture, wearing the same quality of clothing that announced money without needing to say it. But something was different. Adeline couldn't have said exactly what it was, standing on the porch watching the wagon come up the road. Something in the set of the shoulders, maybe. Something slightly less armored than it had been the first time. Or maybe she was looking for it because of the letter, because of those 2 careful paragraphs, because of what Lillian had said. She's not scary, she's just sad. Caleb came to stand beside her on the porch. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They stood together and watched Margaret Hartwell step down from the wagon and look at the ranch the way someone looks at a place they've built a story about that might not be accurate anymore. "Thank you for coming," Caleb said when she was close enough to hear it without raising his voice. Margaret Hartwell looked at him. Whatever she'd expected, anger, maybe, or performance, or some kind of strategic softness, she seemed to recalibrate slightly when she found just him standing there, plain and direct the way he always was. "Mr. Dawson," she said. "Come in," he said. They sat in the front room. Not the kitchen, this was formal enough to do the front room, with its better chairs and the small table where Adeline had set coffee, and the particular kind of cake that Lillian had asked to help make that morning, because Lillian had decided that her grandmother should be offered something good, regardless of the circumstances, and Adeline hadn't argued with that. Lillian was not in the room yet. She'd asked to come in herself in her own time, and they'd agreed. Margaret sat across from Caleb and Adeline, and looked at the cake, and then looked at them. "Your daughter made that," she said. "It wasn't a question." "She helped," Adeline said. Something moved across the older woman's face. "Eleanor used to make a cake like that," she said. "Every Sunday. She learned from the housekeeper when she must have been about Lillian's age." Nobody said anything for a moment. "Mrs. Hartwell," Caleb said, and his voice was very even. "I want to be honest with you about why we asked you to come." She looked at him. "Not to convince you to drop the case," he said. "That's Harrison's job, and that's the courtroom's job, and I reckon we'll all do what we're going to do in 3 days. But I've been thinking about what you said in your letter. About not intending to cause Lillian pain." He looked at her steadily. "I believe you. I think you've believed genuinely that what you're doing is right. And I think you love your granddaughter. I know you loved Eleanor." He paused. "So does Lillian, she told me." Margaret Hartwell was very still. "She'd like to talk to you," Caleb said. "Just talk. Not about the hearing, about her mother." The older woman looked at him for a long moment. Something working behind her eyes, something she was keeping controlled, but only just. "All right," she said. Caleb looked toward the hallway. "Lily." There was a brief pause, and then Lillian came in. She was wearing her good dress, not because anyone had told her to, but because she'd decided to herself, and her hair was braided, and she walked into the room with the particular combination of nervousness and determination that Adeline had come to recognize as this child's signature mode of doing hard things. She looked at her grandmother. Margaret Hartwell looked back at her. For a moment, neither of them said anything, and the room held something fragile and enormous at the same time. Then Lillian went and sat in the chair closest to her grandmother, not on the other side of the table, not at a safe distance, but close, and she said, "I remember when you used to come at Christmas. When Mama was alive. You used to bring oranges." Margaret Hartwell's composure shifted visibly. "Just for a second. You remember that?" "I was 5 the last time," Lillian said. "But I remember I didn't think." The older woman stopped. "You were so young." "I remember lots of things from when I was young," Lillian said. She looked at her hands for a moment, then back up. "I remember that Mama used to smell like rosewater. I remember she could whistle louder than Papa, which embarrassed him. I remember she always put an extra blanket on my bed even in summer, because she said she'd always been cold at night when she was a girl, and she didn't want me to be. Margaret Hartwell's eyes had gone bright. "Do you miss her?" Lillian asked. "Every day," the older woman said. Her voice was different now. Not the formal, controlled voice she'd arrived with. Something underneath it that was just a woman talking about her daughter. "So do I," Lillian said. "I think about her a lot. I talk to Adeline about her sometimes." Margaret looked at Adeline sharply. "She asks," Adeline said quietly. "I think it helps her to talk about Eleanor." "So we do." Something complicated moved across the older woman's face. Something that was trying to be skepticism and not quite making it. "She wasn't trying to replace my mama," Lillian said, and her voice was very clear and very direct. "She never pretended to be my mama. She let me miss her out loud. She didn't make me act like it was done." She looked at her grandmother. "Does anyone let you do that? Miss her out loud?" The room was completely quiet. Margaret Hartwell looked at this child, this composed, clear-eyed, startlingly perceptive child who was her daughter's daughter, in a way that was almost painful to witness, and the composure she'd carried her whole life cracked. Right there in that front room, quietly and without performance, the way real things crack when the right pressure is applied. "No," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "No, they don't. I think that's lonely," Lillian said simply. Margaret Hartwell pressed her hand to her mouth for a moment. Then she reached out and took Lillian's hand in both of hers, and Lillian let her, and the two of them sat like that for a moment, that Adeline felt she shouldn't be watching, but couldn't have left. Caleb looked at Adeline. She looked at him. Neither of them said a word. After a long moment, Margaret Hartwell straightened. She composed herself with the practice of decades, but she didn't put the full armor back on. What came back was something softer, something that could still be dignified without being weaponized. She looked at Caleb. "She's remarkable," she said. "Yes," he said. "She gets that from Eleanor." "She gets a lot of things from Eleanor," he said. "And some things that are just her own." Margaret looked around the room at the house, at the care in it, at the small particular signs of a family that was real, rather than constructed. The cake on the table, the primer open on the side table. The pair of small boots by the door. "I'd like to see the ranch," she said. "If that's all right." Caleb looked surprised, just slightly. "All right," he said. They spent an hour walking, Caleb and Margaret, with Lillian between them, the girl pointing out things and explaining them with the proprietary energy of a child, showing someone their world. The east field and the horses, the barn with Pete's careful systems. The fence line Pete had just repaired, the patch of ground near the south side of the house where Eleanor had planted rose bushes years ago and where Caleb had kept them going every year since she died, not well, not expertly, but stubbornly. Margaret stopped at the rose bushes. She stood there for a long moment. Then she said, without looking up, "She planted those the first summer after you were married." "Yes," Caleb said. "She wrote me about them. She said the soil wasn't right and she was going to make it work anyway," a sound that might have been a laugh under other circumstances. That was Eleanor, he agreed quietly. Adeline hung back and watched from a distance, because this was not hers. This piece of it belonged to them, to the complicated grief of a man who had loved and lost and was still keeping the rose bushes alive, and a woman who had needed to believe the loss had been mismanaged, because that was easier than just carrying it. She went back inside and put more coffee on. When they came back in, something had shifted in Margaret Hartwell's bearing. Nothing dramatic, nothing announced. But Adeline had been paying attention to people her whole life. It was what you did when you were quiet and solitary. You watched and she could see it. They sat back down. Margaret looked at Caleb. "I'm not going to withdraw," she said. "I want to be honest about that." Caleb nodded. He'd expected it. "But I'm going to speak to my lawyers about the tone of the case," she said. "Some of the claims that have been made." She paused. "Some of the witnesses that have been arranged." Adeline went very still. Caleb looked at the older woman steadily. "Bertha Gaines," he said. Margaret met his gaze. "My daughter-in-law made those arrangements." "I wasn't aware of all the details." She paused again. I'm aware now. That testimony could seriously damage my wife's reputation, Caleb said. In a small town, regardless of what the judge decides. I know, she said. And the way she said it was an acknowledgement of something she was unwilling to fully articulate, but was unwilling to pretend wasn't true. I'd appreciate it, he said, if you'd handle that. She looked at him for a long moment. I'll handle it, she said. It wasn't an apology. Adeline understood that it was also not nothing. Margaret left an hour later. At the door, she paused and looked at Adeline directly the first time she'd done that, without a challenge behind it. You chose a hard road, she said. It didn't feel like a choice, Adeline said. It felt like the obvious thing. Margaret looked at her. Eleanor used to say that, she said, about things that were obvious to her that no one else saw. She studied Adeline for a moment. Take care of her. I will, Adeline said. Margaret nodded once and left. They stood on the porch and watched the wagon go. The three of them in a row, Lillian between the two adults with her arms crossed, in the particular way she held herself when she was satisfied about something. That went better than I expected, Lillian said. Yes, it did, Caleb said. I told you she just needed someone to let her be sad. You did, Adeline said. Lillian nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd already known. The morning of the hearing came in cold and clear, the way Colorado mornings came in late autumn, the kind of cold that was honest about itself. Adeline was up before anyone else. She sat at the kitchen table with coffee she wasn't tasting and went through the day in her mind, the way she always went through hard things, not catastrophizing, not reassuring herself with false certainty, just walking through it plainly. What would happen, what she would do, what she would say if she was asked to say something, and how she would say it. She heard Caleb step in the hallway before she saw him. He came in and looked at her, and then at the coffee, and poured himself a cup and sat down across from her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. You sleep at all? He asked. Some, me neither. He wrapped his hands around the cup. How are you feeling? Steady, she said, and it was true. Under the nerves, under the awareness of what was at stake, there was something steady. Something that had been building since the first night she'd sat in that chair beside his bed, since the first morning Lillian had shown her where things were, since every decision she'd made in the weeks between then and now. He looked at her. Same, he said, steady. They sat in the quiet kitchen in the early morning and drank their coffee, and didn't need to say anything more than that. The courthouse in Willow Creek was a single-story building that served multiple purposes: town meetings, occasional traveling circuit court, any official business that required a roof, and some formality. It had wooden benches and a raised platform for the judge, and a general air of trying harder than its means quite allowed. It was nearly full when they arrived. That was the first thing Adeline noticed. She'd expected some townspeople gossip, being what it was in a small place, and a custody hearing involving a prominent ranch owner being exactly the kind of thing that drew attention. She'd expected maybe a dozen. There were at least 40 people in those benches. Martha Ellison, Clara Pruitt, Pete in his best shirt sitting in the front row with his hat on his knee. The general store owner and his wife, the blacksmith. The woman who ran the post office, half that she'd seen at church on the 2 Sundays she'd attended since the marriage. Caleb stopped just inside the door and took it in. You did this, he said quietly. They did this, she said. I just asked. He looked at her with an expression that she was going to think about later, when the day was over and there was time to think. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They sat at the table Harrison had indicated, Caleb on one side of her and Harrison on the other, and across the aisle was the Hartwell party, 2 lawyers in fine suits and Margaret herself, sitting between them with her hands folded in her lap. Margaret's daughter-in-law, Josephine Hartwell, was not present. Adeline noted that. The judge was a man named Foster, 50s, with the weathered look of someone who'd been making decisions in difficult situations for a long time and had gotten comfortable with the weight of it. He came in without ceremony and sat down and looked around the room with an expression that registered, but did not comment on the unusual fullness of the gallery. We're here on the matter of Hartwell versus Dawson, he said. regarding the custody and welfare of Lillian Dawson, minor. I've reviewed the filed materials. He looked at both tables. We'll proceed with testimony. The Hartwell lawyers went first. Their argument was structured and delivered well, and Adeline gave them that they were good at their job. They walked through Caleb's illness, the circumstances of the rapid marriage, the background of Adeline's situation, the claim that the union had been arranged under financial inducement rather than genuine intent. They used words like instability and inadequate foundation and the welfare of the child requires, and they said them in the smooth, confident cadence of men who had said similar things in similar rooms many times before. Then they called Bertha Gaines. Adeline watched her walk to the front of the room, a solid woman, 60 or so, wearing her best dress and keeping the expression of someone who had decided that what she was doing was right and had stopped examining that decision. She sat down and folded her hands and looked at the Hartwell lawyer with the cooperative readiness of a witness who has been prepared. The lawyer asked her what she had observed on the morning of the wedding. She said she had seen Dr. Whitaker arrive at Adeline Mercer's door early in the morning, and she had seen them speak, and she had heard partially. She allowed some discussion that had included mention of the ranch property. Harrison rose. Objection. The witness has acknowledged she heard partially. Judge Foster looked at Gaines. What exactly did you hear, ma'am? Bertha Gaines paused. She stopped. Restarted. I heard Dr. Whitaker mention the ranch. In what context? Another pause. Longer this time. He was explaining the situation. Was money discussed? Bertha's hands tightened slightly in her lap. I believe so. You believe or you heard? A silence. Something was happening in Bertha Gaines's face. Something that looked, under the certainty she'd walked in with, like a woman who was discovering that the story she'd been telling wasn't as solid as she'd thought it was, under direct questioning, in front of 40 people who knew her. I heard the word property, she said finally. I assume. Thank you, the lawyer said quickly, trying to move on. I'd like to continue this line, Judge Foster said calmly. He looked at Gaines. You heard the word property, and you assumed that meant a financial arrangement. Is that correct? Bertha Gaines looked at the judge. Then she looked at the room, 40 people looking back at her. People she'd known for years, people whose opinions of her had weight in her life. Yes, she said, I assumed. The Hartwell lawyer moved quickly to redirect, but the damage was done in the way that quiet damages are done, not explosively, just fundamentally. The centerpiece of their case had just announced in front of the judge that its key testimony was an assumption. Harrison cross-examined briefly and cleanly and let her go. Then their side. Dr. Whitaker testified first. He was steady and precise and credible. Are credible, factual, careful, specific. He described Caleb's condition, his state of mind, the decision he'd made, and the morning he'd gone to Adeline. He said, plainly and on record, that no financial arrangement of any kind had been discussed or offered. He said that in his medical judgment, Caleb Dawson had been clear-minded when he made the decision to marry. He said that in his 20 years of practice, he had never seen a patient's recovery correspond so directly with the presence of a consistent caregiver. Would you characterize Mrs. Dawson's care of her husband as genuine? Harrison asked. I would characterize it, Whitaker said, as extraordinary. Pete testified about the ranch. He was not a polished speaker. He said things plainly, and sometimes circled back to add something he'd forgotten. And he had the good sense not to try to be anything other than what he was. Which was a man who'd worked the Dawson Ranch for 15 years and knew exactly what he'd seen in the past months. She learned fast, he said about Adeline. She didn't know cattle operations from a song, but she listened and she asked, and she didn't pretend to know things she didn't. A woman like that, he stopped, seemed to decide something. A woman like that doesn't do all that because she's after property. She does it because she's after something that matters more than property. The Hartwell lawyer objected to the characterization. Judge Foster allowed it. Reverend Ellis read from his notarized letter. The room was very quiet while he read it, because he was a man who spoke with quiet authority, and what he read was very specific. And what was most specific was the part where he described Caleb's addition to the vows. The part about not holding her to a promise made beside a sickbed, the part about freedom, the part about choice, and the room understood what that meant. It meant a man in the worst moment of his life had been thinking about her freedom instead of his desperation. Then Harrison said, "We'd like to call Lillian Dawson." The Hartwell lawyer objected immediately. "The child is 8 years old." "She cannot be expected. She can speak for herself," Judge Foster said. He looked toward where Lillian was sitting in the gallery beside Adeline. "Young lady, do you understand what it means to tell the truth?" Lillian stood up. "Yes, sir," she said. "It means saying what actually happened, not what you wish had happened or what you're scared might happen." Judge Foster looked at her for a moment. "Come on up," he said. Lillian walked to the front of the room. She was small in that space, the raised platform, the formal setting, the room full of adults watching her. But she didn't look small. She stood with her back straight and her hands in her lap, and she looked at the judge and waited. Harrison stood. "Lillian, can you tell the court about your life at the Dawson Ranch since Mrs. Dawson arrived?" Lillian thought for a moment. Then she said, "She came the same day she married my papa. She brought one bag. She didn't know where anything was, and she didn't pretend she did. She asked me to show her." She paused. "Papa was very sick and I was scared, and she didn't tell me not to be scared. She just stayed. Every night she stayed beside him, and in the mornings she was still there." Another pause. "She taught me to read better. She made decisions about the ranch when Pete didn't know what to do. She wrote letters to lawyers to protect me before I even knew I needed protecting." She looked at her hands for a moment, then back up at the judge. "She did all of that before she had any reason to love us. Before we'd given her any reason to stay." Her voice was very steady. "I know what it looks like when someone's doing something for property. I've seen that. People who want things look a certain way. They watch to see what they're getting." She looked directly at Judge Foster. "Adeline never looked at us like that. She looked at us like we were hers. From the very beginning." The courtroom was silent. Adeline sat in the gallery with her hands clasped in her lap and kept her breathing even and did not let herself look away from Lillian. The Hartwell lawyer rose to cross-examine. He was careful. He was not unkind. He wasn't foolish enough to be unkind to an 8-year-old girl in a room full of people, but he tried gently to suggest that Lillian was too young to assess motives, that she'd been in a vulnerable state. That attachment didn't necessarily indicate legitimacy. Lillian listened to all of it. Then she said, "May I say something?" The lawyer looked uncertain. He glanced at Judge Foster. "Go ahead," the judge said. Lillian looked at the lawyer calmly. "I've been through a lot," she said. "My mama died when I was 4. My papa almost died 2 months ago. I've had people make decisions about my life without asking me for as long as I can remember." She paused. "I know more about real and not real than you think I do. I know the difference between someone who stays and someone who's waiting to leave." She looked at him steadily. "Adeline stayed. Every single time she could have left, she stayed. That's all I know how to tell you." The lawyer sat back down. He didn't ask anything else. There was a recess after the testimony, and during it something happened that no one had anticipated. Harrison came to find Adeline and Caleb in the small side room where they'd been waiting, and he was moving with a slightly different energy than usual. Something contained and careful in his step. "Margaret Hartwell wants to speak with you," he said. He looked at Caleb, "Both of you, without lawyers." Caleb looked at Adeline. She looked at him. "Where?" Caleb said. "She's in the room at the back." They went. Margaret was standing when they came in. Not sitting, standing by the window, with her hands clasped in front of her, in a pose that Adeline recognized now as the woman's version of Caleb's stillness. What people did when they were carrying something, and not sure how to set it down. She turned when they came in. She looked at Caleb. Then at Adeline. Then she said, "I want to withdraw." Caleb went very still. "I've spoken to my lawyers," Margaret said. "They advise against it. They believe we still have a viable case." She looked at her hands for a moment. I've told them that's not what I'm asking. Why? Caleb said. Just that. Direct. She looked at him. Because I came here today to fight for my daughter's child, she said. And I watched my daughter's child stand up in that room and defend a family that she chose. A family she believes in. She paused. I've spent 2 years fighting for Eleanor. I've spent 2 years believing that if I held on hard enough to something, she wouldn't be entirely gone. She looked away. But she's gone, and that's not Lillian's fault, and it's not your fault. She looked at Adeline. And it is certainly not yours. The room was very quiet. I'm withdrawing, she said. But I would like to ask something in return. Not through lawyers. She stopped. I'd like to be allowed to know her. Not to possess her. Not to make decisions about her life. Just to know her. To visit sometimes. She seemed to find the word difficult. Aloud, Caleb looked at Adeline. This was, she understood, his decision. His family first, his call. But he was asking her. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she gave him the smallest nod. He turned back to Margaret. She already told you she misses her, he said. She's not going to turn down her grandmother. He paused. Come at Christmas. Come in spring if you want. Write to her she's a good reader. Something shifted in his voice. Just come as her grandmother, not as a lawyer. Margaret Hartwell closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she looked like she'd set something down that she'd been carrying for a very long time. Thank you, she said. They went back into the courtroom. When the Hartwell lawyer stood and informed Judge Foster that his clients were withdrawing their petition, the room shifted, not with cheering, not with anything loud, just a collective exhale, the sound of 40 people breathing out at once. Judge Foster looked at both parties. The petition is withdrawn, he said. The matter of custody is dismissed. Lillian Dawson remains with her father and his household. He looked at Lillian, sitting in the gallery. You understand what that means? Yes, sir, Lillian said. Good. He closed the folder in front of him. We're done here. They stood in front of the courthouse afterward in the cold noon light. The three of them, Caleb and Adeline and Lillian, and people from the gallery came out and said things and shook hands, and some of the women hugged Adeline in the direct, uncomplicated way women do when they've decided you belong among them. And Pete stood to the fez hat in his hands and looked satisfied in the way of a man who had expected the right outcome and was vindicated. Lillian took Adeline's hand. Just reached over and took it, the way children do when they're not thinking about it, when it's simply the obvious thing. Adeline looked down at her. Lillian was looking at the street, watching people disperse, with her "I have processed" this expression on. It's done, Adeline said. Good, Lillian said. I'm hungry. Caleb made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she'd heard from him, not polished, not performed, just real, just a man who had been holding himself braced for weeks and was finally allowed to let go. He looked at Adeline over Lillian's head, and what was in his face in that moment unguarded, unperformed, just. There was something Adeline carried home with her in the wagon. Sitting beside him, with Lillian between them and the cold air coming off the mountains and the road back to the ranch stretching ahead of them. Something she was going to take a long time to understand. But she knew already that she was going to want to. The ride home from the courthouse was quiet in the best kind of way. Not the quiet of people who had nothing to say, but the quiet of people who had said enough for one day, and were now simply allowing themselves to exist in the aftermath of something large. Lillian fell asleep between them before they were 2 miles out of town, her head tipping sideways until it rested against Adeline's arm. And Adeline let her stay there, and didn't move, and looked straight ahead at the road, and felt the weight of the girl against her, like something she hadn't known she'd been waiting for. Caleb drove without speaking. Once, about a mile from the ranch, he looked over at Lillian sleeping, and then at Adeline, and what was in his face was so undefended that Adeline looked away first. Not because it made her uncomfortable, because it was the kind of thing that deserved privacy even from the person witnessing it. They got home in the late afternoon. Pete was already back. He'd ridden ahead, and he'd fed the horses. and left a lamp burning in the kitchen window, which was such a specific and thoughtful thing that Adeline stood in the yard for a moment after seeing it. Caleb carried Lillian inside. The girl woke up enough to protest that she wasn't tired and then fell back asleep before he'd finished pulling the blanket over her, and he came back to the kitchen and stood in the doorway and looked at Adeline, who was at the stove putting the kettle on, because it was something to do with her hands. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine, I know you are. Sit down anyway." She turned around and looked at him. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. And he looked, she thought, like a man who had been carrying something at high tension for weeks and had just been allowed to put it down and was discovering that his arms didn't quite know what to do without the weight. She sat down. He came to the table and sat across from her. He didn't say anything immediately. He looked at the table, at his hands, at the lamp Pete had left burning. Then he said, "I want to say something, and I want to say it right, so I'm going to take a minute." "Take whatever you need," she said. He looked up at her. "When Sam Whitaker came back from your place and told me you'd said yes, he said, I thought you were being charitable. The way people are charitable to the dying. The way you do something because it costs you less than it costs to refuse." He paused. "I didn't expect you to actually be here. I told you I would be." "I know, but people say things." He held her gaze. "You didn't just say it. You were here every single morning. You made decisions I didn't have the strength to make. You protected my daughter before you had any reason to love her. You fought for this family when you'd barely had time to learn it was yours." He stopped. "I don't know how to account for that. I've been trying to figure out what to say about it for weeks." "You don't have to say anything about it," Adeline said. "I know I don't have to." He looked at her steadily. "I want to." The kettle was starting to hiss behind her. She didn't get up. "The agreement I made with you," Caleb said. "When I was still," he stopped. "When I didn't think I was going to survive. I told you that if I lived, you'd have the choice. That I wouldn't hold you to something made in desperation." He looked at his hands. "I meant that. I still mean it. You can go back to your shop. You can make any life you want. You've earned the right to that, and I'll make sure you have what you need, regardless of what you decide." He looked up. "But I need to tell you something first, before you decide anything." She waited. "I don't want you to go," he said simply. "Without decoration. Not because of Lillian, though God knows she needs you. Not because of the ranch or the lawyers or anything practical. I want you to stay, because somewhere in the last 2 months you became the person I talk to. The person I think about when something happens and I want to tell someone." He looked at her directly, unflinching the way he was, about everything that mattered. "You became the person I want to be, the kind of man that deserves." The kitchen was very still. Adeline looked at him. She thought about the morning she'd opened her door to a doctor with a hat in his hands and a request she should have refused. She thought about the 11-minute ceremony in the side room and the ring that had been his mother's. She thought about 9 nights in a chair beside a man she didn't know, holding his hand through a fever that might have taken him anyway, talking to him in the dark about nothing in particular because she believed he could hear her. She thought about Lillian on the fence rail, and Lillian in the courtroom, and Lillian asleep in the wagon with her head against Adeline's arm. She thought about what she'd said to Caleb weeks ago, at this same table. "I stopped thinking about leaving. I already decided," she said. He looked at her. "I decided a long time ago," she said. "I just didn't say it out loud, because I didn't know if you were ready to hear it." She held his gaze. "I'm not going anywhere, Caleb. This is mine. You're mine." "She's mine." She paused. "If that's all right with you." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Yeah. That's all right with me." He reached across the table and took her hand. Not urgently, not with the grasping quality of desperation. Just took it, the way you take the hand of someone you intend to keep. She let him. The kettle boiled and she got up eventually and made the tea, and they sat at the table until the lamp burned low, talking about small things. The fence. Pete still needed to finish on the north side, what Lillian would need for the winter, whether the roof of the barn was going to hold another season, and underneath the small things was something and quiet and settled. The way ground feels after a long rain when the earth has finally taken in all the water it can hold. That was the night things changed, not in any dramatic way. But something that had been held apart clicked into place, and they both felt it, and neither of them made a production of it. The weeks that followed had their own texture. Caleb got stronger. Not in the sudden, cinematic way that stories sometimes describe recovery, not one morning where he woke up and was simply himself again. It was incremental and sometimes frustrating, and there were days when he pushed past what he should have, and paid for it the next morning, and Adeline was not gentle about pointing that out. "You're limping," she said one morning, watching him come in from the barn. "I'm fine. You said that yesterday and spent the evening not moving from that chair." It was different. It was the same thing. She looked at him. "Pete can handle the far pasture. You know he can." "I know he can," Caleb said, pulling off his coat. "I just stopped. You don't like needing help," she said. He looked at her. "I know," she said. "I don't either." "We're the same that way." She handed him the coffee she'd already poured. "But you're going to let Pete handle the far pasture today, and you're going to sit at that table and look at the account books you've been avoiding. And tomorrow you're going to be able to do more than you could today." That's how it works. He took the coffee, he sat down. "You're bossy," he said, but without any edge. "I prefer the word practical," she said. He looked at her with something in his eyes that was just barely not smiling, the expression she'd come to know as the closest he got to it when he was amused by something he didn't want to encourage. "Practical," he said. She said, and went back to the stove. Lillian watched this exchange from the doorway, with the expression of someone filing information for later reference. The letter from Margaret Hartwell arrived 3 weeks after the hearing. It was addressed to Lillian in careful handwriting, and inside was a pressed orange blossom, dried fragile, tucked between 2 sheets of paper, and a note that said, "Your grandmother used to send these to your mother every year when they bloomed. I thought you should have one." Lillian held it for a long time. Then she brought it to Adeline and said, "Can we press it properly, so it keeps?" They spent an afternoon doing exactly that, the two of them at the kitchen table, with the primer moved aside, and a heavy book and 2 sheets of parchment, working carefully, talking about Eleanor, the way they'd learned to talk about her openly, without the conversation becoming unbearable. The way you talk about someone when the grief has gone from sharp to carried. "Do you think she would have liked you?" Lillian asked. Adeline considered it honestly. "I don't know," she said. "I think she would have had opinions about me." Lillian thought about that. "She had opinions about everyone," she said. "Papa says that's what he loved about her." "Sounds about right," Adeline said. "I think she would have liked you," Lillian decided. Eventually, after she'd tested you a few times, Adeline smiled at that. "I can handle tests." "I know," Lillian said. "That's why I think she'd have liked you." Christmas came. Margaret Hartwell came with it, as promised arrived 2 days before Christmas in the fine wagon, staying at the boarding house in town because she was self-aware enough to understand that staying at the ranch would be too much too soon, and coming out each day to spend a few hours with Lillian. The first day was careful, the second was easier. By Christmas Eve, Lillian was showing her grandmother the rosebushes, Eleanor's rosebushes, the ones Caleb had kept alive stubbornly, and explaining which ones had bloomed best this year, and which ones needed attention in the spring. And Margaret stood in the cold and listened to every word with the particular attentiveness of someone who is a grandchild and knows they have lost time to make up for. Caleb watched from the window. Adeline came to stand beside him. "You all right?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. He watched his daughter take his former mother-in-law's hand and lead her toward the barn to see the horses. "Yeah, I'm all right." He turned to look at Adeline. "You did that. Lillian did that. You gave Lillian the room to do it." He held her gaze. "That's not nothing." She looked back out the window. Margaret was laughing at something Lillian had said, a real laugh, unexpected. The kind that gets past your composure before you can manage it, and Lillian looked pleased with herself in the direct, uncomplicated way of children, who have said something funny and know it. No, Adeline agreed quietly, it's not nothing. There was one more thing. One more moment, late on Christmas night, after Lillian was asleep and the house had gone quiet, that Adeline hadn't planned for, and that arrived anyway the way the important things tend to. She was putting out the lamp in the front room when Caleb came in and held out his hand. In it was a ring, not the plain ring she'd been wearing, his mother's, the one from the ceremony. This was different. Small, simple, with a detail of work on the band that meant someone had spent time on it. I had it made in town, he said, about a month ago. He looked at it. I know you have the other one. I know what that one meant and why we did it. But he stopped. I wanted you to have something that was chosen. Not emergency, not arrangement. He looked at her. Something that means I would have asked you anyway. Given time, given a different world where we'd met in some ordinary way, he paused. Would have asked you, and meant every word of it, and hoped like hell you'd say yes. Adeline stood in the low light of the front room of the Dawson Ranch, the house she'd walked into as a stranger, the house that had become more hers than anywhere she'd ever lived, and looked at this man. This particular man who had been a dying stranger, and had survived and had somewhere in the surviving become the person she built her days around without ever deciding to. She held out her hand. He put the ring on her finger. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him. Yes, she said, since you're asking properly. Something in his face went completely open in a way she'd only seen a handful of times, unguarded, uncomplicated, just real. Yeah, he said. Yes, she said again. Caleb Dawson. Yes. He put his hands on either side of her face and kissed her, and it was not the first time, and they both knew it wouldn't be the last. And it was nothing like the arrangement they'd made in a small side room on a cold morning, with a dying man holding himself upright by sheer will. It was entirely its own thing, which was, she thought, exactly right. The years settled into the Dawson Ranch the way good things settle, not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, one season into the next, each one adding something to what had come before. Caleb's strength came back fully by the following spring. He wrote again, worked again, laughed more than he had in years, a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere unclenched, the kind that Lillian said she hadn't heard from him since before her mama got sick. Adeline heard it, and each time she did, she felt something in her own chest ease a little further open. The ranch grew. Pete hired 2 more hands the following year, and Caleb made decisions about it with the calm confidence of a man who had come to the edge of losing everything and had found out what actually mattered, which had clarified a great many things. He expanded the grazing land by buying the adjacent parcel when it came available. He repaired the barn roof before it failed rather than after, which was a different kind of man than he'd been before, not worse before, just more inclined now toward preservation, toward care, toward not taking for granted what could be taken. Adeline kept the tailor shop. She hadn't intended to. She'd thought at some point she would simply close it, that it would become a chapter that ended cleanly when the next chapter began. But she found she didn't want to close it. She went in 2 days a week, kept taking work, kept the sign in the window, and gradually understood that it wasn't about the money or even the craft entirely. It was about the things she'd built when she had nothing else, and about not abandoning things just because you'd added new ones. Caleb never once suggested she close it. That too told her something she'd already known. Lillian turned 9, and then 10, and then 12, and with every year she became more herself, more articulate, more curious, more certain in the particular way of people who have been through hard things young and have come out knowing their own weight. She corresponded with Margaret Hartwell, who came twice a year and brought oranges at Christmas without fail, and who had become not family exactly, not the simple kind, but something in that territory, something chosen and complicated and real. She still talked about Eleanor, she always would. But she talked about Adeline, too. And the way she talked about Adeline was the way she talked about things that were simply true, without qualification, without the careful framing of someone explaining a complicated situation. She said my mother when she talked about Adeline, and she said it the way she breathed, without noticing she was doing it. The first time she said it, Adeline had been at the stove and hadn't turned around for a long moment. When she did, Lillian was looking at her with those gray-green eyes, steady and direct, and waiting to see if she'd done something wrong. Adeline said, "Come here." Lillian came. Adeline held her for a moment, just held her, the way she'd learned to do when words were less precise than presence. Then Lillian said, into her shoulder, "Is that okay?" "That's more than okay," Adeline said. "That's everything." Lillian went back to her homework. Adeline went back to the stove. And somewhere in the middle of that ordinary evening, in that ordinary kitchen, the last piece of something very large and very important settled quietly into place. On the evening of their 3rd anniversary, Caleb and Adeline sat on the porch in the cooling dark and watched the summer stars come out over the mountains and said very little because they were people who had learned they didn't need to fill every silence. After a while, Caleb said, "I've been thinking about something." "What?" He was quiet for a moment. "The morning Sam came to tell me you'd said yes. I was lying there thinking I had maybe 2 more days, and I was trying to figure out how to make them count for something. Trying to figure out if there was one more thing I could do for Lillian before." He stopped. "And then Sam came in and said you'd agreed, and I thought, well, whatever happens next, I did that right. I got her someone real." He looked at Adeline. "I had no idea what I was actually getting." She looked back at him. "What were you expecting?" she asked. "Someone kind," he said. "Someone steady, someone who would keep their word." He looked at her. "I was not expecting someone who would walk into a broken house with one bag and make it into something I'm proud of. Someone who would fight for my daughter like she'd carried her herself. Someone who would sit at this table at the end of every day and be the person I most want to talk to in the world." He paused. "I didn't have the right to expect any of that." "You didn't ask for it," Adeline said. "It just turned out to be what was needed." "Yeah," he said. "And you gave it, all of it, without being asked." She looked out at the dark and the stars, and thought about a morning 2 years ago when she'd put on her good blue dress and locked her tailor shop and walked out into a cold morning toward a life she couldn't have described. She thought about 11 minutes in a side room, and 1 bag and 9 nights in a chair, and a little girl asking, "Are you really staying?" and a man looking at her across a kitchen table saying, "I see you." She thought about all the ways this life had not been what she'd planned. She thought about how completely she did not wish it had gone differently. "I have something to tell you," she said. He turned to look at her. She held his gaze. "We're going to need a bigger house," she said. It took him a full 3 seconds. Then something crossed his face that she had never seen there before, raw and immediate and lit up from somewhere inside. The expression of a man who has already had more than he thought he deserved and has just been handed something more. "Adeline," he said. "Spring," she said. "Dr. Whitaker says spring." He reached over and took her hand, the way he'd taken it, the night he'd given her the ring, not urgently, not desperately, just with the complete and steady certainty of a man who intends to hold on. She felt his thumb trace over the ring on her finger. The ranch was quiet around them. The horses moved in the field. Somewhere in the house, through the open window, they could hear Lillian moving around, doing whatever she was doing at this hour, being alive and present in theirs. 3 years ago, Caleb said quietly, "I sent a man to your door to ask you to marry a dying stranger." "Yes," she said. "And you said yes, I did." He looked at her. "Best decision either of us ever made." She looked back at him, at this man who had refused to die, who had chosen her before he knew her, who had been teaching her ever since what it looked like when someone gave you their actual self without holding any of it back. "Yes," she said simply, and she meant it with every part of the life she had built. In this house she had made her own, beside this man she had chosen as completely as she had ever chosen anything. Some things begin as sacrifice and become grace. Some things begin as a desperate agreement between strangers and become the truest thing either of them has ever known. Adeline Mercer had walked into a dying man's house with one bag and her word. She had stayed, and staying had given her everything.